What if the voice inside your head is not telling you the truth? What if most of your anxiety, most of your stress, most of your suffering comes not from reality, but from the stories your mind keeps repeating? For thousands of years, philosophers have warned us about a hidden enemy. Not outside, inside, your own thoughts. And today, modern psychology is beginning to confirm what the Stoics understood centuries ago. Your mind can become your greatest servant or your worst prison. Right now, as you listen to these words, there is another voice speaking. Not mine, yours, the voice inside your head, the one that comments on everything, the one that judges, questions, remembers, predicts, worries, plans, and never seems to stop. For most people, this voice is so constant, so familiar, that they barely notice it anymore. It has become the background noise of existence, a companion that follows them everywhere, from the moment they wake up until the moment they fall asleep, and sometimes even in their dreams. But here is the question few people ever ask. What if that voice is not always telling the truth? What if many of the problems consuming your energy exist nowhere except inside your own mind? Imagine a person waiting for a message. Minutes pass, then hours, no response. Immediately, the mind begins constructing stories. Maybe they're upset. Maybe I said something wrong. Maybe they don't like me anymore. The anxiety grows. The emotions become real. The suffering becomes real. Yet nothing has actually happened. Only a story created by the mind. This happens every day. Someone looks at us differently. A coworker sounds distant. A business opportunity takes longer than expected. And instantly, the mind fills the silence with assumptions, most of which never become reality. The Stoics understood this long before modern psychology existed. They recognized that human beings rarely suffer because of events themselves. They suffer because of the meaning they attach to those events. A simple situation appears, then the mind interprets it, expands it, dramatizes it, until a small concern becomes a personal crisis. Today, psychologists have a name for many of these patterns: catastrophizing, rumination, negative prediction, cognitive distortions. Different names, same phenomenon. The mind creating suffering where suffering does not yet exist. Modern neuroscience reveals something fascinating. The human brain evolved primarily for survival, not happiness. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors survived because they constantly searched for danger. A rustle in the bushes, a strange sound in the dark, a potential threat nearby. Those who assumed danger often survived. Those who ignored it often didn't. As a result, the brain became exceptionally skilled at finding problems, even when no immediate danger exists. The ancient world called this fear. Modern science calls it the negativity bias. Different language, same reality. Your brain pays more attention to threats than opportunities, more attention to criticism than praise, more attention to risk than peace. And in today's world, that ancient survival mechanism has found endless fuel. Social media, breaking news, economic uncertainty, comparison, information overload. The modern mind processes more information in a single day than previous generations encountered in weeks. And yet, more information has not created more peace. In many cases, it has created more confusion, more anxiety, more mental exhaustion. Millions of people spend entire days trapped inside imagined futures, rehearsing conversations that never happen, preparing for disasters that never arrive, reliving mistakes that can no longer be changed. Their bodies remain in the present, but their minds live somewhere else entirely. This is why overthinking is so dangerous, not because thinking is bad. Thinking is one of humanity's greatest gifts. The problem begins when thinking becomes compulsive, when reflection becomes obsession, when awareness becomes imprisonment. The Stoics observed that many people were no longer directing their minds. Their minds were directing them. And nowhere was this more evident than in the life of a Roman emperor who spent years fighting wars, facing uncertainty, and carrying the weight of an empire on his shoulders, yet somehow remained remarkably calm. His name was Marcus Aurelius, and what he discovered about the mind would influence psychology nearly 2,000 years later. Imagine carrying the weight of an entire empire on your shoulders, millions of citizens, thousands of soldiers, endless political conflicts, economic instability, war on distant frontiers, and every decision capable of changing countless lives. This was not a thought experiment. It was the daily reality of Marcus Aurelius. Today, many people imagine that power creates peace, that success eliminates anxiety, that reaching the top somehow silences the mind. Marcus Aurelius learned the opposite. The higher the responsibility, the greater the pressure, the greater the uncertainty, the greater the opportunity for fear to take control. Yet history remembers him differently, not as a ruler consumed by panic, not as a man destroyed by stress, but as one of the calmest minds ever recorded. How? The answer can be found in a collection of private writings never intended for public eyes. Personal journal written during military campaigns, often in cold camps, far from Rome, surrounded by uncertainty. Today we know those writings as meditations, but Marcus Aurelius never wrote them for an audience. He wrote them for survival, because he understood something that most people never realize. The greatest battle of life is not external, it is internal. Every day, Marcus observed the same phenomenon inside himself. Events happened, then thoughts appeared, then emotions followed, and somewhere between those steps, suffering was created. Most people assume their emotions come directly from events. Something happens, and they feel bad. But Marcus noticed a hidden step: interpretation. The mind creates a story, and the story creates the suffering. A soldier arrives late. The mind says, "This is a disaster." A criticism appears. The mind says, "They don't respect me." A problem emerges. The mind says, "Everything is falling apart." The event is real, but the story is optional. This realization became one of the foundations of Stoic philosophy. Marcus repeatedly reminded himself that external events are often outside our control, but our judgment about those events remains ours. In one of the most famous passages in Meditations, he wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." For nearly 2,000 years, those words have survived. Not because they sound inspiring, but because they describe a psychological truth, a truth that modern science would later confirm. Today, psychologists studying anxiety and emotional regulation have reached remarkably similar conclusions. Many emotional struggles are intensified not by reality itself, but by our interpretation of reality. Two people experience the same situation. One collapses under stress, the other adapts. What changed? Not the event, the meaning assigned to it. Marcus Aurelius trained himself to examine every thought before accepting it as truth. He understood that the mind can exaggerate, distort, catastrophize, and deceive. Just because a thought appears does not mean it deserves belief. This idea feels obvious, yet most people spend their entire lives believing every thought that enters their minds. Every fear, every doubt, every insecurity, without ever questioning whether it is accurate. Marcus refused to surrender that power. He treated thoughts as visitors, not rulers, something to examine, not something to obey automatically. And perhaps this is why his philosophy remains so relevant today. Because modern life generates endless mental noise, notifications, opinions, predictions, comparisons, fears. The average person is exposed to more mental stimulation in a single day than previous generations experienced in weeks. And yet the mind remains the same, still vulnerable to fear, still vulnerable to stories, still vulnerable to illusion. Marcus discovered that freedom begins the moment we stop believing everything we think. But if thoughts are not always trustworthy, why does the brain create so many negative ones in the first place? To answer that question, we must look deeper, not into philosophy, but into human evolution itself. Let's try to understand a little bit why our brain creates suffering. If your mind creates so much anxiety, so much worry, so much unnecessary suffering, then an obvious question emerges. Why? Why would the human brain evolve this way? Why would nature design a mind that often works against us? The answer begins tens of thousands of years ago. Long before cities, long before technology, long before modern civilization, imagine a human being walking through a dense forest. Every sound could signal danger. Every shadow could hide a predator. Every unfamiliar movement could mean death. In that world, survival depended on one thing: constant vigilance. The people who assumed everything was safe often didn't survive. The people who expected danger usually did. As a result, the human brain evolved with a powerful bias. A bias toward detecting threats. A bias toward focusing on what could go wrong. A bias toward negative possibilities. This mechanism helped our ancestors survive. But in the modern world, it often creates suffering because the brain still operates using ancient software, even though the environment has completely changed. Today, most people are not running from predators. They are running from deadlines, financial pressure, social comparison, uncertainty about the future. The threats are different, but the brain reacts the same way. A difficult email arrives. The brain treats it like danger. A business opportunity fails. The brain treats it like danger. Someone criticizes you online. The brain treats it like danger. The body releases stress hormones. The heart rate increases. The mind begins preparing for battle, even when no real physical threat exists. This is why modern anxiety can feel so overwhelming. Your body is responding to imagined dangers as though they are real. The Stoics observed this centuries before neuroscience existed. They noticed that people often suffered more from anticipation than reality, more from imagination than experience, more from fear than from actual events. Seneca wrote, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." Think about that. How many things have you worried about that never happened? How many nights have been lost to fears that never became real? How many disasters existed only in your mind? Most people never count them. But if they did, they would discover a surprising truth. The majority of their suffering came from predictions, not reality. Modern psychology calls this catastrophizing, the tendency to imagine the worst possible outcome, and then emotionally react as if it has already happened. The mind says, "What if I fail? What if they reject me? What if everything falls apart?" And suddenly the body behaves as though the catastrophe is already occurring. This creates a vicious cycle. Fear creates thoughts. Thoughts create emotions. Emotions create more fearful thoughts. And the cycle repeats again and again and again, until people become trapped inside mental prisons of their own creation. But here is the crucial realization. Your brain is not broken. It is doing exactly what it evolved to do. Its job is survival, not happiness. Its job is protection, not peace. The problem is not that your brain produces fearful thoughts. The problem begins when you automatically believe them. This is where the Stoics separated themselves from most people. They understood that a thought is not a command. A thought is not a prophecy. A thought is not reality. It is simply a mental event, something that appears and then disappears, unless we give it power. Marcus Aurelius practiced this distinction constantly. He learned to observe his thoughts without immediately identifying with them, to question them, examine them, challenge them, instead of surrendering to them. And modern psychology has arrived at a remarkably similar conclusion. One of the most effective treatments for anxiety is learning to create distance between yourself and your thoughts, to observe them rather than obey them, to recognize that thoughts are experiences, not facts. This single shift changes everything, because the moment you stop treating every thought as truth, You begin reclaiming control of your mind, and that leads us to one of the most practical lessons in all of Stoic philosophy, a method so powerful that it inspired modern cognitive therapy, a method developed by a former slave who became one of history's greatest teachers. His name was Epictetus, and what he taught may be the key to mental freedom. There is a Stoic method for mental clarity. There was a man who owned nothing, no wealth, no title, no army, no political power. For part of his life, he was a slave, and yet thousands of years later his ideas continue to influence psychology, leadership, and human behavior. His name was Epictetus, and he discovered something so simple that most people overlook it, yet so powerful that it can change the way you experience every problem in your life. His entire philosophy can be summarized in a single idea. There are things you can control, and things you cannot. That is it. Simple, obvious, and incredibly difficult to live by, because most human suffering begins when we confuse the two. We worry about other people's opinions. We worry about the economy. We worry about the future. We worry about outcomes that have not happened yet. We spend enormous amounts of energy trying to control things that were never ours to control, and then we wonder why we feel exhausted. Epictetus saw this pattern everywhere. People were not suffering because life was difficult. They were suffering because they were fighting reality itself, trying to command what could not be commanded, trying to possess what could never belong to them, trying to guarantee outcomes in an unpredictable world, and reality always wins that battle. Every time. One day someone insults you. Can you control what they said? No. Can you control their opinion? No. Can you control their behavior? No. But can you control your response? Yes. And according to Epictetus, that changes everything, because the event itself is often much smaller than our reaction to it. Someone criticizes us, and we replay it for days. A mistake happens, and we relive it for months. A setback occurs, and we allow it to define years of our lives. The original event lasts moments. The suffering lasts far longer, not because of the event, because of the story. This insight became one of the foundations of modern cognitive behavioral therapy, one of the most effective psychological treatments ever developed. The principle is remarkably similar. Events do not automatically create emotions. Interpretations do. Two people can experience the exact same situation. One feels devastated, the other remains calm. Why? Because between the event and the emotion, there is interpretation, and interpretation can be challenged. Imagine you send a message. Hours pass. No response. The mind immediately creates explanations. They are ignoring me. They are upset. I must have done something wrong. Anxiety begins to grow. But what are those explanations? Facts? No. They are assumptions, stories, possibilities, nothing more. Epictetus taught his students to pause in moments like these, to separate reality from interpretation, to ask a simple question. What actually happened? Not what you fear happened, not what you imagine happened. What actually happened? The answer is usually far smaller than the story. A message was not answered. That is the fact. Everything else is interpretation. This habit creates an extraordinary kind of freedom, because it teaches you to stop fighting imaginary battles, to stop suffering from predictions, to stop treating assumptions as reality. Marcus Aurelius practiced this relentlessly. Whenever something disturbed him, he stripped it down to its simplest form. A criticism became words, a setback became an event, a fear became a thought, and once stripped of interpretation, many problems lost much of their power. This does not mean life becomes easy. It means life becomes clear, and clarity is powerful. Because the clearer you see reality, the less power illusion has over you. The Stoics understood that peace does not come from controlling the world. It comes from controlling your relationship with the world. And when you finally understand that distinction, something remarkable begins to happen. Your mind becomes quieter, not because problems disappear, but because you stop creating unnecessary ones. And that is where true freedom begins. Not freedom from circumstances, but freedom from the prison of your own interpretations. How do we find the freedom of our own mind? For most of their lives, people search for freedom in the wrong places. They believe freedom is money, freedom is status, freedom is success, freedom is having more options, more opportunities, more control. And yet history offers countless examples of wealthy people who were miserable, powerful people consumed by anxiety, successful people trapped by fear, because external freedom does not guarantee internal freedom. The Stoics understood this better than most. To them, the greatest prison was never made of stone. It was made of thoughts, invisible, constant, and often self-created. A person could live inside a palace and still be a prisoner of worry, a prisoner of anger, a prisoner of insecurity, a prisoner of endless mental noise, and another person could possess very little, yet remain deeply free. Because true freedom begins in the mind. This is where Stoicism becomes more than philosophy. It becomes practice. A daily discipline, a way of training attention. Because attention is where life happens. Whatever captures your attention begins to shape your reality. Focus on fear, and fear grows. Focus on resentment, and resentment grows. Focus on what you lack, and life begins to feel empty. The mind follows attention, and attention follows habit. This is why the Stoics were so careful about what they allowed into their minds. They understood that every repeated thought becomes stronger, every repeated fear becomes more convincing, every repeated story becomes easier to believe. Until eventually, the story feels like reality. Modern neuroscience supports this idea. The brain constantly strengthens pathways that are used repeatedly. Thoughts become patterns, patterns become habits, habits become identity. What you repeatedly think, you eventually begin to believe, and what you believe begins to shape your life. This is why mental freedom requires awareness. You cannot change a pattern you cannot see. You cannot challenge a thought you never question. You cannot escape a prison you do not realize exists. The first step is noticing. Noticing the fear, noticing the assumption, noticing the story, and creating a small space between yourself and the thought. In that space, something powerful happens. Choice appears. For the first time, you are no longer reacting automatically. You are responding consciously. And that difference changes everything. The Stoics practiced this every day. Not because they expected perfection, but because they understood that mastery of the mind is a lifelong process. Even Marcus Aurelius struggled. Even Seneca struggled. Even Epictetus struggled. The goal was never to eliminate difficult thoughts. The goal was to stop being ruled by them, to recognize that thoughts are visitors, not masters, clouds passing through the sky, not the sky itself. This understanding creates a profound sense of peace, because suddenly, every thought no longer demands obedience, every fear no longer demands action, every doubt no longer becomes reality. You learn to observe, to question, to let go, and slowly, the mind becomes quieter, not silent, but quieter, clearer, stronger, more resilient. And perhaps this is the ultimate lesson of Stoicism. Freedom is not found by changing the world around you. Freedom is found by changing your relationship with the world inside you. Because the moment you stop believing every thought, you stop being controlled by every thought. And that is where real freedom begins. The day we stop believing in every thought. For most of human history, people searched for enemies outside themselves, in distant lands, on battlefields, inside rival nations. But some of the greatest philosophers who ever lived discovered something unexpected. The most difficult battle was never outside, it was inside, a battle against fear, against illusion, against the stories the mind creates and then mistakes for reality. Marcus Aurelius fought wars across an empire. Epictetus survived slavery. Seneca navigated political chaos and uncertainty, yet all three arrived at the same conclusion. The greatest source of suffering is not always what happens to us. It is what we tell ourselves about what happens. A thought appears, then another, and another. Most people never question them, they simply believe. They believe every fear, every prediction, every doubt, every insecurity, and little by little, they surrender control of their lives to the voice inside their heads. The Stoics chose a different path. They learned to pause, to observe, to question, to separate reality from interpretation, because they understood something that modern psychology is only continuing to confirm. Thoughts are not facts. Thoughts are not commands. Thoughts are not reality. They are possibilities, mental events, passing clouds in the sky of consciousness. And the moment you understand that, something changes. The mind loses some of its power over you. The future becomes less frightening. Criticism becomes less painful. Failure becomes less personal. Uncertainty becomes easier to tolerate, not because life becomes easier, but because you stop fighting battles that exist only in your imagination. Think about how much energy has been lost to thoughts that never became reality. How many nights were spent worrying about outcomes that never happened? How many opportunities were missed because fear convinced you not to act? How many years were spent trapped inside stories that were never true? The Stoics would ask a simple question. What would your life look like if you stopped believing every thought? What would change if you treated thoughts as suggestions instead of truths? How much peace would return? How much freedom would appear? Because freedom is not the absence of difficulty. Freedom is the ability to remain steady in the presence of difficulty, to see clearly, to think deliberately, to choose your response rather than surrendering to impulse. And that is the true purpose of Stoicism. Not to eliminate emotions, not to become cold, not to suppress your humanity, but to develop clarity, the clarity to recognize that your thoughts are tools, not masters. And perhaps that is the most valuable lesson of all. You cannot control every thought that enters your mind, but you can choose which ones deserve your attention. And that choice can change the course of an entire life. If this video made you reflect on your own mind, subscribe to Timeless Philosophers. Because the greatest wisdom is not learning something new. It is seeing clearly what was always there.